It is negative 30 degrees Celsius. The wind is howling across the desolate slopes of Kholat Shakhl. In the local Mansi language, that name translates to something terrifying, the mountain of the dead. January 1959, a group of 9 students and graduates from the Ural Polytechnical Institute set out on a 2-week winter expedition. Led by 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, this was not a group of careless amateurs. They were highly experienced hikers seeking their Grade 3 certification, the most elite level of mountaineering in the Soviet Union. Originally, there were 10. But on January 28th, Yuri Yudin fell ill with severe joint pain and was forced to turn back. It was a heartbreaking moment for him. He had no idea that this illness had just saved his life. By February 1st, deteriorating weather and a blinding snowstorm forced the remaining 9 off their planned route. Instead of pushing forward into the dark, Dyatlov made the safest, most logical decision. They pitched their tent on the exposed treeless slope of Kholat Shakhl. It was a routine procedure. They ate a modest dinner of salted pork and bread. They joked in their diaries. They prepared for sleep. And then the timeline shatters. When the group failed to report back weeks later, a massive rescue operation was launched. On February 26th, they finally found the camp. But the relief instantly turned to horror. The tent was abandoned. It was half buried in the snow, and it hadn't been unzipped. It had been violently slashed open from the inside. Footprints leading away from the tent showed the hikers fled into the freezing night. They left behind their boots, their heavy coats, and their survival gear. Some footprints showed they were wearing only socks. Others were completely barefoot. They were running blindly into the pitch-black forest, fleeing from a terror so absolute that freezing to death in minus 30 degrees seemed like the better option. Following those desperate treks, investigators found the first 2 bodies beneath a massive Siberian pine tree at the edge of the forest. They were dressed only in their underwear. The branches of the tree were snapped up to 15 feet high, embedded with their skin and blood. They had been frantically climbing, tearing their own flesh. Between the tree and the tent, 2 more bodies were found, including Igor Dyatlov. They were frozen in dynamic poses, trying to crawl back to the shelter. It took months to find the remaining 4 people. In May, as the snow melted, their bodies were discovered deep in the forest, in a ravine, buried under 4 meters of snow. These 4 were dressed much more warmly compared to the others. There were even cuts on some of the clothing. It was clear that, in a desperate bid to survive, they had forced the clothes of their frozen friends onto themselves. Although this seemed like a logical struggle for survival, the true horror emerged when the autopsy reports were released. Because at this point, the hypothermia theory was completely shattered. The bodies of these 4 individuals bore inexplicable physical trauma of an unbelievable magnitude. Nikolai Thibaut Brignola's skull was fatally fractured. Alexander Zolotaryov and Lyudmila Dubinina had massive fractures in their chests. Their ribs were literally crushed to pieces. The chief medical examiner, Dr. Boris Vozrojdeny, stated that the force required to create such damage could not have belonged to a human or a wild animal. He likened the immense force applied to being struck by a freight train or a truck moving at full speed. But the most terrifying and impossible part of it all was this: there wasn't a single scratch, a single bruise, or any sign of a cut or impact on the outside of their bodies. All the destruction had occurred solely on the inside. It was as if a massive, invisible pressure wave had crushed their chest cavities and shredded their organs. The horror did not end there. The eyes of victims Lyudmila Dubinina and Alexander Zolotaryov were missing, their facial tissues had degraded, and Lyudmila's tongue had been completely ripped out by the root. Although authorities tried to attribute this to scavengers in the ravine, the way the tongue was torn out and the fact that the other bodies remained intact refuted this claim. To further compound the absolute impossibility of the crime scene, a radiological analysis was requested on the victim's clothing. The results were blood-curdling. Inexplicably high levels of beta radiation were detected on the clothing of the victims found in the ravine. Some of the garments they wore were literally radioactive. What was radiation something you would expect to see in a nuclear laboratory doing on these ordinary university students in the middle of the Ural Mountains? Faced with evidence that defied all scientific explanation, the Soviet government did what it did best during the Cold War years. It quickly and quietly covered the incident up. Chief Investigator Lev Ivanov was ordered to close the case immediately. The cause of death went into the official records with that infamous, meaningless phrase, "an unknown, compelling natural force." The area was strictly forbidden to civilians and researchers for exactly 3 years, but the truth refuses to stay in the dark. As the years passed, theories about what the Mountain of the Dead witnessed that night grew like an avalanche. The most widely accepted theory was a slab avalanche. It was claimed that when they dug into the slope to pitch their tent, they weakened the snow, and during the night, a hard block of snow silently slid onto the tent, crushing their ribs. The panicking hikers had cut the tent open and fled, later freezing to death. However, this theory was full of logical flaws. An avalanche could not explain the missing tongue or eyes. An avalanche could not explain the radiation, and most importantly, there was no avalanche debris at the scene to disturb those footprints that led away from the tent in an orderly fashion. Another claim was the Karman vortex street, created by the wind on the mountain. Kolatsyakhl's dome-like structure, when combined with a storm, could produce low-frequency infrasound waves. These waves, which the human ear cannot hear but the brain perceives directly, were known to cause severe nausea, paranoia, and sheer terror. Could the mountain itself have driven them mad in the dark? Although it is a plausible horror scenario, this theory once again left the broken ribs and the radiation unanswered. And finally, the darkest and perhaps the closest theory to the truth, a secret Soviet weapons test. Years later, Chief Investigator Lev Ivanov, who was forced to cover up the incident, made a critical confession. On the night of the event, other camper groups miles away from the mountain had reported seeing glowing orange spheres hovering in the sky. Ivanov stated that the radiation reports and the mention of these spheres were deliberately erased from the file. Could an experimental parachute mine or a radiological weapon detonating in the air have been tested that night? Could the massive shockwave created by this airburst weapon have crushed the hikers' chests without leaving a mark on the outside, just like being in a pressure chamber? Theories were debated for decades, cases were reopened, but none of them could put together all the pieces of what happened that night. 9 young, bright, and hopeful lives walked into the darkness on that freezing winter night, leaving behind a blood-curdling secret that will never be fully solved. Kolatsyakhl, the Mountain of the Dead, buried its secrets under that snow forever. So, what do you think? What awaited them in the darkness on a freezing winter night when the wind howled?